patchy at best, must do better. The report card phrases that fit when assessing how big business is responding to the social revolution of healthy, longer lives. I'm Susan Flory. On The Big Middle this time, we delve into what needs to change with economics professor Andrew Scott, co-author of The 100-Year Life, Living and Working in an Age of Longevity. Lovely stroll through Regent's Park to your office, where we're sitting down right now at the London Business School, Professor Scott. You've got a nice view over the courtyard. Are our lectures over for the day?
Yes, they are, although for me they are. They carry on for the students till about 9 o'clock, so it's an intensive campus.
How do most of your students react when you tell them they'll likely be working into their 70s and 80s?
Actually, the students, by and large, are quite positive, I think. They're looking forward to engagement. They see work as an important part of their engagement. Not everyone I speak to is so positive. I think when I tell people in their mid-40s that they've got probably more work to go than they've done already, you can almost hear an audible gasp in the room as they start to think about the consequences of that.
Well, we have those fantasies, don't we? We're fed on them, depending on our ages, that, retirement, the golf course, the cruises, seeing the world.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, one of the things about the 100-Year Life was we point out that people are unaware of the gains in life expectancy that have happened. And they tend to judge both their life expectancy and their life plan on what their parents or even grandparents did. And that model is trying to be stretched to fit a longer lifespan, and it's not really working very well.
No, and you, in your book and in all of your articles, I've gone through a lot of your work, you can remind us why the current three-stage life model that society made, let's face it, in the last century, it's obsolete, although it's baked into everything we do.
It is, yeah. And it was kind of, so I've often given a lecture here at the school over the years on future trends, and one of those lectures is on the ageing society, how the average age of society across the world is increasing. And it's a pretty miserable lecture because it says there's so many old people, we can't afford the healthcare, we can't afford the pensions. And it struck me every year I gave it that there was a sort of a disconnect, because the average fact is that on average we're living longer and we're healthier, which would be good news. So how do we find this bad news story? And then I realised it was because what's really happening is we're living for longer. And people tend to think about that as about ageing, as about end of life. But really it's about all of life. We have more time. And time is a social construct. In the 20th century, we invented the weekend, we invented teenagers, we invented retirement. And in the 21st century, we're having to reinvent whole new stages. And we see people in their 20s behaving differently, in their 70s behaving differently, and in their 40s and 50s. But what we haven't really done is change our structure of life. We still have this three-stage life of education, work, and retirement. That worked well for 70 years, but if you were living to 100, that second stage, the career, becomes a 60-year career.
Absolutely, and how do you manage that? In 1900, the life expectancy was 50. And now we're looking at half of the children who were born in 2000 will live to be over 100.
Yeah, if current trends carry on. And even if it's not 100, even if it's 95, we cannot stretch our existing structure to support lengthier careers. And, my worry is that if all governments do is just increase the retirement age, it's not really going to be good, because we need to think about what we do with our education system, what we do with our financial system.
The policy lag is astonishing, because no one is owning this agenda.
Yeah, and you can see across the world that governments are changing with all sorts of things to do with longevity, to do with technology. I think if you look at the agents of change, they're going to be either the individuals, companies, or the government. Individuals are already doing quite a lot of very different things. Governments are always very schizophrenic in this area, because they worry about Monday morning, but they're quite prepared to do things that affect you 50 or 100 years ahead. It's the bit between 1 year and 5 years that they tend not to try and touch. And corporates, I think, in general, are even worse than governments in this regard. They're doing, with a few exceptions, relatively little.
Well, you have in your book, The 100-Year Life, and in the articles that you've written since, because that book came out with your co-author and your co-academic, Linda Grattan. Grattan, thank you. That came out in 2016.
Yeah.
Has anything changed since then, since you added your voice and your intellectual capital to the debate? Have you been approached about coming up with some concrete solutions about how we can move everything off where it is?
Well, I have to say we've been surprised and pleasantly surprised by the success of the book globally. I mean, it is done exceptionally well across the world. And I think, hopefully that's because the book itself is well written and interesting, but clearly something's happening in the world at the moment. People are beginning to realise this is a pressing issue. You know, I was an undergraduate 30 years ago and I was writing about this topic, but it now seems to be percolating into people's consciousness. Probably because as the baby boomers retire, it becomes a real issue rather than a prospect.
And boomers are not used to just sort of rolling along with things. We rise up.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, they were kind of one of the first group to invent teenage years, and they're also now transforming retirement. So the book has had a great success, and you know what we wanted to do in writing the book, I think, was in particular try and get a new narrative around aging, one that was more positive. And I think that's what's been seized on. So I think both the timing was right and the positive message. And companies and governments are responding to that. So the Japanese government has set up a commission for how to live a 100-year life, literally in response to the book. A number of governments are talking to us. And a disparate range of institutions, from primary schools to secondary schools to pension funds to employers, are starting to engage in this debate.
Well, the Japanese government, and that was directly linked back to your book.
Apparently, yes. Yeah.
Oh, wow. And they're at the vanguard because they've got the biggest cohort of the biggest aging population.
And they have the biggest gains in life expectancy. So no wonder the book has done very well. There's even been a manga edition of the book come out in Japan, which is great. So there has been, you know, and I'm impressed at the momentum the book has maintained. Here we are 2 years later.
But structurally, there is still this disconnect. And we've got experienced workers. They're still being marched out the door of companies in their mid-50s. And let's face it, final salary pensions, what is it now, 10% in the United States, the only stat I could find. They are relics.
So, I mean, it's very hard to know how to look at this challenge because it's a huge challenge. And, you know, I said earlier about the invention of teenagers. It took about 50, 60 years to sort out what teenagers were, what to call them and how they should behave. So social change happens slowly. So if you look at it in that regard, the question is, you know, are we very slow or is some progress being made? And certainly we haven't made enough progress, and certainly we need to be quicker at the progress we make. But there is quite a lot of change already happening. You look at the percentage of people working after the age of 60, it's more than doubled in America the last couple of decades, same in the UK. And I'm seeing a lot of social experimentation, so I'm seeing some firms begin to experiment. But undoubtedly there are some major challenges. One is there is still endemic ageism, which is a real challenge. When we invented jobs, we didn't invent jobs for older workers, and so there's a bit of a puzzle what to do with them.
And it's because we all get lumped into that massive demographic cohort, and they don't seem to realize the segmentation that exists between 50 and 90. You could be 50, 60, 70, and still as vital as you were, even more so in your 30s and 40s when you had kids and no sleep.
So I think there's a number of things that are happening. One is there's some stereotypes that were never valid that are still being used, so that older workers are unproductive. Older workers can't learn, and I don't think that's ever been true, but they persist. Secondly, because we are living, on average, healthier for longer, the stereotypes have got also out of date. So, you know, in some sense, people in their 60s now are as fit as people used to be in their 50s, and 70s as fit as people used to be in their 60s.
Well, let's say
and the reality lags behind.
The reality certainly lags behind, and sorry for jumping on your sentence. If I was the head honcho, CEO of, you know, a FTSE 100 company at the moment, what would the business case be that you would make to me to get me to hire the over 50s? There's what, more than 1 million languishing just in the UK, and even though there are more over 60s at work in the UK, across Europe, and in the United States, there's still a big slice of the population that isn't working and wants to work.
So I can give the business case, but I can also put what the problems are and why progress is slow. But the business case, I think, is quite straightforward, and there are actually several of them. The first is that this is a group of people who are fitter and healthier at their age than ever before. And some of that to do with health and some of that to do with education. But this group is more productive than any other group before of their age. So that's case number one. Secondly, I think if you look at what's coming along demographically, in particular with immigration trends, this is a group you need to focus on because there's a lot of skills and knowledge that's about to walk out the door. And certainly in the US and in the UK, you should expect to see a fall in immigration. There's not a large cohort coming through. And so if you want to think about your workforce, making the most of this older workforce is going to be important. Thirdly, I think the role of technology is very interesting because if you look at AI and robotics, they're both going to be fantastic for supporting older workers. Robotics help older workers in manufacturing by taking on some of the physical work, and AI is a sort of cognitive prosthetic. It helps you remember things. And then we're also told that these technology is going to put an emphasis upon people who have got the human skills of judgment, dealing with uncertainty, understanding people and teamwork, which, whilst I'm very wary of age stereotypes, tends to be in the data the things that older people start to...
That's just a natural process, isn't it? We've got more experience.
Well, yes, and there's some evidence that older individuals are very good at... It's a diversity story. The more diverse teams, the better the performance. And older workers are part of that diversity story. And some of the evidence suggests that actually focusing on team performance is a real strength of older people. So, that they should therefore be excelling with this new technology. So there's definitely a business case to be made. And then, of course, there are challenges as well. So, for instance, older workers might not want to get retrained. But if you're retiring at 60 and you're 55, you have a very different incentive to retrain than if you're working till you're 70.
And if you've got one of those elusive final salary pension packages.
Exactly. I mean, undoubtedly one of the reasons why we're seeing an increase in people working after 65 is to do with the fact we now have DC, not DB pension schemes. And of course in the States there's also health insurance.
Yeah, and let's face it, the last decade has not been easy on the wallet. For most people,
Exactly.
There has been stagnation in wages.
Exactly. But, I mean, that's then when we start to get some of the complexities because a three-stage life is a rather simple corporate model. It's a nice standard model. And I think one of the really big challenges we've got within corporates is that we still lack a very good means to measure productivity. And therefore, age is a big component of how much people get paid. The longer you're in a firm, the higher your wage. So even if productivity doesn't decline with age and is maintained with age or even increases with age, the danger is that salaries rise faster than productivity. So, of course, where you tend to find the cost-cutting happening is workers in their 50s. And that's a really, really big problem.
So human resource departments need to take up the challenge and put some packages together that might appeal to someone who really does not want to sit around for 30 years and really loves the company they're working for, doesn't mind maybe lopping off a little bit of the salary in order to have more flexibility within the work week.
Well, so that's then the flexibility. But this then comes back to this precisely the same issue that we found with gender over time, which is that I think it's possible to design more flexible work, but it's a major headache for companies to do it, and they're always firefighting on their current problems. So we've got a new technology that should enable work to be more flexible. I think there's a growing number of people who want more flexible work, and we are indeed seeing more flexible work. So we are starting to see a process of change, but it always lags behind the potential speed that we could have or that we would like.
One of the things I've talked about in my other interviews that I've done for the podcast is how I have found there aren't a lot of access points. I'm a big fan of your multi-stage life model. Fantastic. I've chopped and changed a lot over the years and I enjoy it. I always want to be challenged within my work. But I think you get to a point, and if you're in your 50s and you're looking to move here and move there, you still need to pay the bills. Not everybody is rolling in dough. Yeah. And there aren't a lot of access points to the jobs that are out there. Where is the over 50s job fair or the over 60s job fair? There are a few companies that seem to be doing apprenticeship programs in this area, but that's about it. And we're talking about really relatively low-skilled jobs at these companies.
No, that's right. And, it's hard being a social pioneer because you are ahead of society, and the danger is that can come at a cost. And this is the sort of thing about knowing how optimistic to be. I completely agree with your analysis. We've got a problem and there's a market that's missing. Of course, as an economist, what I know is that if there's a market missing, people start sniffing around and thinking they can make money from it.
I'll just jump in here. Is that helicopter?
Yeah.
Just outside. Taking a look at the courtyard at the London Business School. Love that. Move along now.
Well, we're quite near the American Embassy, so it may well be something to do with that.
Okay, gotcha.
So, there is a gap in the market. Now, of course, what I find interesting is I've probably in the last 6 months spoken to 10 different people, all of whom had the idea of trying to find a matching technology that helps older people find these job opportunities. So I think
that's exciting.
Very exciting, and someone will come up with it. And I think, this is what I think is interesting in this space, because most innovation happens outside of large corporations. And I think that's particularly a problem for large corporations that are run by people in their 40s and 50s who may not really understand the reality of what people need to have in their 60s and 70s.
But once they get to their 40s and 50s too, you get the feeling, I mean, it's just what I sense is everybody's kind of under the radar waiting for that summons to the HR department to be told, oh, we've got this great buyout for you.
Well, I think some people are nervous. And what actually worries me is a lot of people aren't nervous enough. Because they say, well, I'm fine, I'm early 50s, I've got another 15 years to work, I'll start putting money aside for my pension, everything will be okay. And then they are genuinely shocked when they're the one that gets the call. They thought their skills would see them through to mid-60s, and then their whole health and financial plan was based around that. And then they find actually they weren't in as strong a position as they thought.
I think this is what's soul-destroying for a lot of people, like me, over 50. Your wisdom and your experience does not count. It's not valued.
No, or that it's not valued enough because they think you're not a digital native, or they think that you won't learn the new skills, they don't bother providing the new skills.
Which is ridiculous because, the video display terminals that you and I worked with when we were first starting out, we have moved along as technology has advanced.
No, absolutely. I mean, the irony, of course, is the older you are, the more changes in technology you've seen. And if you're 100, you've seen some pretty spectacular changes in technology.
Absolutely. And who's delivered all of this? Steve Jobs.
Yeah. So there's all sorts of stereotypes. But I think, this is one of the challenges we stress in the book, because that three-stage life isn't working currently, given how long careers need to be. So if you are in your 40s or your 50s, you need to think, well, can I rely upon this job? Should I invest in my skills now? Should I think about putting money aside to manage my next transition? So rather than have the transition be forced upon you, how can you actually try and prepare for it?
But the thing is, we live in the world we live in, and it's not all down to personal choices and options and whims. And I was struck when I was reading, I was flipping through your book, and you conjure a rosy, optimistic picture of people, happy, smiley people, fairly, skipping through life with ease, later life, and learning and going hither and yon. And it's not like that, though. There are bills to be paid and food needs to be put on the table. So a lot of people feel trapped in survival mode the whole time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's only one thing worse than a life that's nasty, brutish and short, and that's a life that's nasty, brutish and long. And if we just elongate things, that's a challenge. So there needs to be a very big response from work. I mean, our starting point is that as a society, we design our institutions to bring about some generally good state of welfare. And we've designed our institutions to support a 70-year life. And it's not working as we live for longer. And there's lots of different ways in which it's not working. One is that, as you say, you'd be denied the opportunities because you're laid off in your 50s. The other is that you're not laid off in your 50s, but you have to just keep working and working and working.
The slog never ends.
So, so we therefore need to start thinking about how we introduce a different working model.
Well, what do you think about the gig economy now and people scraping along from one precarious hustle to the next? I was reading the other day, and wherever, Uber wages are down 53% from 2014 to now. And there was talk of having portable benefits.
Yeah.
I mean, even the people who set up their stall and say, I'm a guru of this or that, they're scrabbling for money.
So, the gig economy is relatively small. It's about 0.5% of employment. But what you're seeing is a huge growth in non-alternative employment. So freelancing, flexible work hours, zero-hour contracts, and then there's a little bit the gig economy. If you look at the people, particularly in the gig economy, there's a range of motivations for doing it. And some people are very happy, it's providing exactly what they want, but there's an equal number who are very unhappy, and this is not what they want. It's part of being the precariat. And, there's a number of issues here that we have to focus on. So one is, we've got a labour market now which is challenging for many people. And when we had that with the Industrial Revolution, we saw a labour movement that helped protect people. I'm not seeing the equivalent to that. We need some form of civil society that's going to start to defend people's rights.
There's no universal approach or response, coordinated action to this.
But we are, of course, seeing our politics being put under a lot of strain, because what you've seen in general is a lot of risk being transferred onto individuals. So there's no longer defined benefit pensions, so now the individual has to provide for themselves and deal with their longevity risk and deal with their own savings. We're seeing with the gig economy a great deal of risk and uncertainty. So we are looking at, as a political process, how we support people. So you can start to see the suggestions you were talking about, where we start to provide insurance to the person, not the job. So you get the portable benefits where you carry around. I mean, my own take, and Linda and I are working on a new book which tries to look at some of these issues, is that when you get a new technology, the first people to exploit it for financial gain. And that then creates all sorts of tensions for us as individuals and as society, because we say, well, that may be working for you financially, but this isn't working for us socially. And of course, we saw this with the Industrial Revolution. With the Industrial Revolution, we suddenly saw the creation of work and home. Beforehand, the two were blended together. The factory created a place of work, and it defined work time. Therefore, it defined leisure time. And initially the families were all together in the factory, and then the middle-class reformers said it would be terrible to have children in the factory. The children were kept at home, which meant that someone then had to be the homemaker and raise the children. And then you had 6 long working days, and the family were being separated, and you saw a major trade union movement that started to introduce, first of all, a 5.5-day week, then the weekend, then a 40-hour week. As we said, well, let's try and reconstitute something of family time. So we need to make sure that we get the institutional response to a new technology.
And there's no glimmer of it happening. It's just sort of all of these issues are there to be tended to, but nobody's looking out.
Well, I wouldn't say there's not a glimmer. I think there are glimmers. I think what there isn't is a mainstream approach politically or obvious policies what to do, because we don't know what to do. It's the same with the Industrial Revolution. I mean, you had the rise of Marxism, fears of communism. You saw the rise of major labour movements. And, there was a time of great unrest as we started to change all of our social institutions.
Now it's just fear and anxiety and chaos.
Well, there was something of that during the Industrial Revolution. And I think what was interesting is you saw, filling the gap, the rise of lots of charitable institutions, which I think we're seeing a little bit today. And then eventually government said, right, this is what we're going to do. This is how we deal with it. So I think, that the parallels are strong. We've got a combination of longevity and new technologies, which are upending all our rules of life. And the 100-Year Life focused on how longevity was making the three-stage life not work, but technology is also making all sorts of other things not work anymore.
Your book was fascinating to me, a little bit scary as well. Who would you say should read your book, must read, for your students, for kids who are 18, thinking about careers? Gone are the days where you sign on to one company and take that final payout.
Well, as with any author, I'd recommend anyone would read the book. But I think, to my mind, there's 2 key groups. I think people in their 30s and 40s, early 50s need to read it, because I think they're assuming a pattern that worked for their parents' generation but isn't going to work for them. And the earlier they adapt, the better placed they are to respond to it. Then they can start to look for careers that will be something they want to carry on, or they can get jobs in later life. They can start to think about their finances and how they prepare to support themselves.
Well, if I could just interrupt, you say something that's a really good line. You say people have to quit doing everything for recreation and start focusing on recreation.
Absolutely. I'm glad you like that line. I was very pleased with that one. So with the Industrial Revolution, we saw the growth of the leisure industry, which was sort of entertainment. But I think what we're now seeing is a growth of a leisure industry that's about investment. You're investing in yourself, whether it be investing in your health, keeping fit, spending time with your family and community, or learning new skills.
We've had the rise of experience holidays, and now we need to have the reskilling phase. And instead of going off to the Costa whatever.
My colleague Herminia Ibarra here has a very good way of putting it. She said she's a specialist in transitions, and she says you used to wait until you got fired or promoted to have a transition. Now you will be causing your own transitions. And I think that's a very good way of thinking of things. Then in terms of readership, I do wish I could find a way to get it to a younger generation. The book appeals to different audiences in different countries, which is very interesting. In the States, it tends to be people about 60 who are just focusing on pensions and finances. In the UK, I think 40 and 50-year-olds find the whole issue of what am I going to do for my next stage of my career that most resonates.
you do need to start pivoting and doing something else, reskilling in your 30s.
Yeah.
If you're going to be setting a path out for yourself where you can keep living the multi-phase life that you've defined.
It is, I agree. And I think if you combine longevity with technology, it's obvious you have to do a lot of investment at every decade. And the investments change. And one of the problems I have is that most people are looking to, like governments, to solve this problem by just looking at investment in savings, just save more for your pension. But actually, it's so much more than that.
Let's talk about the intangible assets, because you devote a lot to that in your book, and that was fascinating to me, because we all think in terms of financial gain.
We do, and as an economist, I think that's interesting, because actually there's a presumption that economists is all about money, but actually we're not. But it was very interesting when we first started giving a talk about the 100-year life to a corporate audience. And, I'd say to people, good news, you're living longer and you're healthier for longer. And particularly amongst sort of mid-50-year-old men, the response was not one of delight, but one of gloom. And it was like, well, how can the response to being told that you're going to be living healthily for longer be one of, oh my God, that's bad news? And it was, of course, they just thought, I'm going to have to keep working for longer. And that, I thought, was just a really insightful response, because, we should be looking as a society and individuals to create a life path that we like, not one that is a burden to us.
I think people feel trapped by their decisions, and the shoulda, woulda, couldas happen. You think, but I can't. I need the money line.
Well, absolutely. And so you may have to rethink about your whole attitude towards money too. I mean, that's maybe part of this. But, but what was then apparent was with the three-stage life, education, work, retirement, as we live for longer, all the discussion is about extending the second stage. It's about when I retire. It's about, can I save more for retirement, or can I lower my pension? And none of those are terribly appealing thoughts. Working longer, having less in retirement, or saving more. But our response was, well, actually, you just may need to change the three-stage life, because the three-stage life is a pretty modern invention, and we don't have to stick with it. So how would you change life? Well, I think that's to say, well, why did we arrive at a three-stage life? Well, it worked for a life of 70. So we thought about a broader asset framework. So we have 4 assets. One is financial, and, a longer life, you have to think about how you can finance it. And it does involve working longer, saving more, or spending less. But we also said, you can solve your financial challenge if you're living to 100 by having a 60-year career. But that's a pretty gruesome thought, a 60-year career, because what can you learn at 20 that is still relevant when you're in your 70s? And, even if technology doesn't take away your job over a 60-year career, which it's likely to do, would you want to do the same thing for 60 years?
No, let's hope there's been a lot of growth within that time period.
Yeah, but just keep going and doing the same thing is probably going to get quite dull.
Yeah, you max out completely. You have to do something different.
So, and we therefore introduced 3 intangible assets, which you referred to. And, we think about structuring life as thinking about these 4 different assets: your finances, your productive assets, your skills and knowledge. And some of that is about education, some of that's about learning on the job, but also it's your network, the people you learn things from. The second intangible asset was your vitality assets. And in fact, that itself has 2 types. There's your mental and physical health, which certainly won't be strong if you have a 60-year career worked as intensely as people do. And then your relationships, because, of course, what every study of lifetime happiness tells you is that money does make you happier, it just doesn't make you happy. What really makes you happy, though, is relationships and creating the scope to love and be loved.
And you were talking, though, about being more intentional about those relationships.
Yes.
Making sure that you're in a partnership that's going to work for you through the years, into the later years.
Well, the longer you live, the more you have to invest in everything, including relationships. And, of course, a great fact in the UK is divorce is declining. But the bad news is it's increasing for people aged over 50, including 80 plus. So, the longer life is, the more you have to invest in everything, including relationships. And then the third intangible asset, which we argued has not been important in the past, but will be increasingly important, is what we call transformational assets, your ability to deal with change. And, and big changes in life, some people find them easy, some people find them hard. But in a 3-stage life, there aren't many of them. There's sort of the teenage years, entry into adulthood, and then there's entry into retirement. But in a multi-stage life, you're probably going to go through a lot of transitions. And some of those will be chosen by you, some of them will be forced upon you. But being able to deal with them and to invest in them and to surf them is going to be increasingly important.
You have to know yourself, don't you? That's critical.
Well, I think that's the other interesting thing about, what is the purpose of this longer life. It comes after the years of having children, so it's not obvious what the evolutionary purpose of this longer life is. And there is something almost Buddhist-like about a multi-stage life. And I think, the really interesting question is what's going to make it your multi-stage life? A lot of our current identity comes from the single job we have over a long career. But I think in a multi-stage life, that won't be the case. And I think you can see the younger generation working very hard on their identity and not being constrained to it being, it's because I work for this firm or do this job. But it will be interesting, I think, what is the narrative thread or the values that connect everything that you've done in your life, even if it's done very different things. What is it that makes it your life?
So, as well as get corporations to change their collective mindset, we need to change our own and realize we have to be independent, productive producers off our own bat.
Yeah, it's you can't settle down. I think that's we talk about juvenescence and the need to sort of be playful with your sense of self throughout your life, because if you do become fixed in your habits, fixed in your values and fixed in your opinions, change is then quite wrenching when it comes. And of course, if you don't change in a longer life, there is a risk that you will lose out because of it. So being more open-minded, more playful, preserving something of a spirit of adolescence into later life. So being open to meeting new things and having new ideas will become important. And continually having every sort of perhaps decade to invest in new relationships, in your health or in your skills. And that's not something that we've been encouraged to do in the past. And also it's quite tiring because you might be quite comfortable where you are right now, or you might be completely full on in all the things that you're doing and not have any bandwidth for anything else.
But we want more social capital, we want diverse networks, but
Yeah.
I think there comes a point where, too, even if you are vital, if you're doing everything that you possibly can to maintain your physicality, you're tired. You're tired of the push to achieve, the push to perform. And maybe we just have to retire the word retirement.
Well, I certainly agree with that, because it's clear, the retirement, just the idea that there's a single age where everyone comes to a hard stop at work has clearly gone completely. There's no single age at which people retire, and what they do at retirement, many still carry on working, full-time, part-time, entrepreneurship, social activity. It's already, I think, gone. And retirement itself now seems to have 3 stages. One where you're still working, one where you're fit and healthy and want to enjoy yourself, and one which it looks more like a traditional end of life where options become constrained and life becomes physically more challenging and frail. So we've already seen retirement, I think, blown up.
But people still talk about it when they're young. I'd like to retire and I'm going to be golfing every day. And we're still socialized, so we're feeding people this fantasy of golden years.
Well, I think, it's another challenge. The more I look at this, there's sort of a couple of challenges we have. And actually, they're linked into a problem around how we think about age. 200 years ago, government started keeping accurate birth records. Before then, no one really knew what day they were born or what year they were born. So no one was interested in their birthday. No one had birthday parties. The happy birthday song was invented in the 20th century. And when you used to ask people how old they were, they would either not know, they'd either give it to the nearest decade, or they'd say I'm a father or I'm a grandmother, or they'd say I'm still fit and healthy. But once government started keeping an accurate track record of how old you were, they started to segregate society by age. So that you went to school at this age, you left school at this age, and of course you became old and you retired at 65.
It marks out our entire life.
It does, and I think that's had 2 problems that's caused, many problems. One is I like to stress that actually what really matters is biological age, how fit and healthy you are. But we insist upon measuring things by chronological age. And as people are getting fitter and healthier for longer, we're missing all of that. So, it's very interesting to me. We obsess about an ageing society and there's more old people. But actually what's also happening is how our ageing is changing. And, people are younger for longer. To call it an ageing society, I think, is to miss the point. So, there are more old people, but also we're aging better. And individually and as a society, we want to try and support as many people aging as healthily as possible. But that involves thinking not about chronological age, but thinking about people's biological age. But we are obsessed that chronological age tells us something about you.
I really am on a mission for everyone to reclaim their birthdays.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. But I think, what will be good about that too, because the other thing I know about aging is that people age very differently. Some people age brilliantly and they're literally running 100 metres age 100, others in a wheelchair at age 50. So it's not just that our age stereotypes are out of date because of this shift between chronological and biological age, that we're aging better, but also there's just so much diversity. It's a very crude way of characterising it. But I think that's then linked into the other problem that this focus on chronological age has had. We've become very age segregated. So it's much harder now to mix intergenerationally. And the consequence is that people in their 20s think that people in their 40s, 50s, 60s and 70s are old, which is probably they've always done, but they also don't really know what people are like. And similarly, 70-year-olds don't know what 20-year-olds are like.
Yeah, we really need to expand our networks across the generations.
We do, and if we don't, we get the absurdities of things like millennials and Gen X. The idea that you can characterise vast numbers of millions of people by the fact they like avocado and they're completely different from you at age 70 is ridiculous. People are just people. And
absolutely.
we need to break down that intergenerational divide and a reliance upon chronological age. That's at the heart of all these challenges.
There's resentment now, and the way society is structured and the way mainstream media keeps reinforcing the messages. Millennials, they resent older people because we've had the houses and we've had the jobs for life, and now we're going to go off into the sunset and enjoy ourselves, and they're going to be scrabbling for their entire hard lives.
And actually that leads, I think, to a problem. I'm very nervous about the intergenerational conflict story, because I'm sure there's always been a conflict between the generations, and it may be slightly greater now, but I don't think it's a defining feature. What I find really, really frustrating about a lot of governments and corporates is they don't understand that today's young will be tomorrow's old, that there's a life course. And so there's sort of an assumption that millennials will always be young, and therefore they won't be old. But of course, what you develop now for people in their 40s and 50s and 60s will be what the millennials will experience. So when you think more about the life course, and I think that's what's so dangerous about these generational labels, because really what is happening is that with longevity and technology, we need to redesign life, careers, education, so much of what we do. And that's a shared problem for 50, 60-year-olds as well as 20, 30-year-olds. It's particularly acute for 20 to 30-year-olds because they've got the biggest redesign to do. Yeah. But we sort of need to come together intergenerationally and start thinking, how do we structure things? And
in the face of so much unpredictability.
It is. And things, I think there is a real challenge for people who are young, because they will find it hard to get, a degree no longer is a passport for career success as it used to be. You're going to be older until you get a house. You're going to be paying rent for longer. You're going to have less of a pension. There are, many, many challenges. There's also many positives as well. I mean, you will have a longer life. You'll probably be fitter for longer. You've got more freedom around gender identity and things of those issues.
And no one knows where the jobs of the future lie.
No, but I think it's unhealthy. It's a very unhealthy discussion to sort of set it up between young versus old. We need to think a little bit about how we actually restructure life to support a new life course, and think about things more intergenerationally. Because if we think about just transferring income and assets from the old to the young, I think that doesn't solve the problem. It may be part of the solution, but what we've really got is an unsustainable life system, because a three-stage life no longer works given technology and longevity.
And the energy that everyone's putting into it, you say there is the momentum. I was sort of, downgrading it, saying I didn't see much out there, the glimmers. But who do we look to? We're used to relying on corporations, big operators, governments. It seems to now be falling to all of us to move it along ourselves to enjoy better, longer lives.
No, but I think in a way that's probably sensible, because we will need massive corporate and government support. But I don't think they should be led by corporates and governments, because they don't know what we want. And I think this is a challenge. We still don't know what we want. The people who are 100 years old today, and there aren't many, but they're growing in number, they didn't have to think how to structure a 100-year life. They've just had the genetics to get there. So we just don't know how to live this life. So we will be looking around and saying, hey, that's interesting. I've just seen this TV program, or this person in the media is doing this. That's interesting. And we will start to copy and experiment. But I think there's enough of a consensus in some areas that firms should and some are responding. So the need for flexible working in the run-up to retirement and after retirement seems to me pretty clear. And some firms are beginning to respond to that.
If you could change one thing tomorrow, personally, just before we go, what would that be?
Well, I think it would be trying to get governments and corporates to focus on the course of life rather than say, I've got 7 different generations in the workforce, what does each one need separately? It's thinking about this in what I would call a recursive and a dynamic manner, because what you do in your 20s will influence what you do in your 30s right the way through. So it's thinking about the life course rather than just particular stages.
I mean, a lot of people just be saying, man, that's way too much planning for me.
Yeah.
But you've got to do it.
But this is where social norms come in, and one of the problems we've got is that social norms answer questions. So if I were to sit down and had no idea about what anyone else was doing, and you asked me the question, how should I live my life, I wouldn't know where to begin. So social norms are really important, and when social norms break down, you need to be much more mindful of what works for you.
Thanks so much.
Great.
Economics Professor Andrew Scott of the London Business School, co-author of The 100-Year Life, Living and Working in an Age of Longevity. You can find links to Professor Scott's work and book on the show page, however you're listening to this podcast. And you can find The Big Middle at susanflory.com and all your favourite pod apps. We'll have more relevant information and inspirational interviews about midlife and beyond on the next Big Middle. Thanks for listening.